1941. The Siege of Leningrad. German tanks are tearing toward the city, and suddenly, they are wiped off the face of the earth by fire from the latest German guns. Guns that Germany had manufactured for itself. This is the story of the Tallinn, a ship that wasn't supposed to exist. In official textbooks, this story is told in only a few dry lines. But today, we are going to dig deeper. We will find out why Soviet sailors called this cruiser a cursed grave and refused to step on its deck. We will discover where 20,000 tons of unique, secret steel vanished without a trace. Forget everything you've heard before. What you are about to learn in the next hour will force you to reconsider the outcome of the greatest confrontation of the 20th century. Fasten your seatbelts. We are heading aboard the ship that won the war, without ever leaving the harbor. The end of 1939. In the closed offices of Moscow and Berlin, a tense silence reigns. The two largest powers in Europe have just signed a non-aggression pact. But diplomatic smiles hide cold pragmatism. Both sides understand that a massive confrontation is inevitable. It is only a matter of time. And at this very moment, in the shadow of the looming global conflict, a deal takes place that still makes historians raise their eyebrows in surprise. A Soviet delegation arrives in Germany with an incredible list of demands. They aren't interested in machine tools or raw materials. They want advanced military technology. In those years, the Soviet Union was rapidly building up its naval power, but it desperately lacked the experience to create heavy, modern ships. The eyes of the Soviet specialists fell upon the shipyards of Bremen, where steel skeletons rose high. These were the heavy cruisers of the Admiral class, the crown jewel of German shipbuilding. Imagine a floating fortress over 200 meters long. 10,000 tons of armored steel, capable of reaching immense speeds and carrying the most sophisticated optics, electronics, and monstrous firepower. True masterpieces of the gloomy Teutonic engineering genius. The Soviet diplomats pointed to these holes and said, "We want to buy this." Imagine the reaction of the German admirals. It took their breath away. Give away their newest secrets? Hand over a cutting-edge heavy cruiser to a state they were fundamentally opposed to? The Naval Command was categorically against it. Officers pounded their fists on oak tables. "This is madness. We are arming our potential opponent." But big politics was overruled by economics. Germany critically needed resources, oil, grain, rare metals to sustain its industry. And at the highest level, an unprecedented decision was made. They agreed to sell the Soviet Union the unfinished hull of the cruiser Lutzow, the fifth ship of the series. The price tag was staggering, 104 million Reichsmarks, an astronomical sum, equivalent to dozens of tons of pure gold. For this money, the Soviet Union received a massive hull, 70% complete, the main battery turrets, and a firm promise from the German side to deliver all missing mechanisms within the coming year. In the spring of 1940, powerful tugboats slowly pulled the gray steel giant through the leaden waters of the Baltic. There was no crew on deck, no flags. Only the cold wind blew through the empty, echoing compartments, which smelled of fresh paint and machine oil. The ship arrived in Leningrad. There, it received a new name, Petropavlovsk. On the surface, it seemed like a brilliant diplomatic victory, a perfect move. But as soon as the cruiser docked at the Soviet shores, something strange began. The German engineers who arrived to assist with the assembly worked suspiciously slowly. Vital blueprints mysteriously went missing. Parts for mechanisms were delayed in transit for months. The Soviet leadership sent angry telegrams demanding the schedule be met. But in response, they received only polite excuses. Looking at the empty engine shafts, Soviet engineers began to ask themselves a question no one dared to speak aloud. Was this a simple logistics failure amidst the European crisis? Or was a cold-blooded, carefully planned act of sabotage unfolding right before their eyes? To answer the question of sabotage, one must look at the blueprints. What exactly did the Soviet engineers see when they first stepped onto the deck of the purchased cruiser? Cold, gray steel. miles of tangled wiring, a literal labyrinth of hundreds of compartments. The Admiral Hipper class was not just a ship, it was a challenge to all global standards. According to international naval treaties of the time, heavy cruisers had strict limitations: 10,000 tons. That was the absolute ceiling for displacement. All naval powers played by these rules, or at least pretended to. But German designers created a machine that flagrantly ignored these limits. At full load, these ships weighed over 18,000 tons, nearly double the allowed limit. Imagine the power hidden in this hull. 8 heavy guns capable of sending massive shells over the horizon with terrifying precision. The famous optics, complex rangefinders that looked like alien technology to the uninitiated. Powerful steam turbines designed to push this mountain of steel through the waves at high speed. But here's the detail few thought about at the time. What the Soviet Union bought for an astronomical sum was not a finished masterpiece. It was a giant, incredibly expensive puzzle, and half the pieces in the box were missing. By the time the cruiser Petropavlovsk was securely moored at the piers of Leningrad, its readiness was estimated at about 70%. Of the main artillery, only 2 turrets out of 4 were in place, the forward and aft lower ones. Anti-aircraft guns were indeed installed, and the ammunition for them was delivered in full. But the heart of the ship was silent. The main propulsion plant was unfinished. The cruiser could not move an inch under its own power. Over 60 German engineers and technicians arrived in Leningrad to help with the assembly. They walked the echoing decks, whispering quietly, adjusting complex instruments. However, the pace of work was excruciatingly slow. Weeks turned into months. Vital elements of the fire control systems were delayed. Armor plates for the upper deck were lost somewhere. Soviet shipbuilders watched this with growing irritation. Yes, they were gaining invaluable experience working with complex foreign tech, but the ship itself remained a prisoner of the shipyard. Perhaps the suppliers in Germany truly couldn't handle the volume of their own orders. Logistics were cracking under the strain of rising tensions in Europe. But whatever the reasons for these delays, time was relentlessly running out. The calendar turned to the summer of 1941, and very soon, disputes over missing blueprints would lose all meaning, giving way to a harsh reality. In the summer of 1941, the world changed overnight. The global conflict, both long-awaited and dreaded, crashed into the Soviet borders with its full weight. All the arguments about equipment delays and angry telegrams to Berlin suddenly became irrelevant. Yesterday's technology suppliers instantly turned into an implacable enemy, and their army was rapidly advancing toward the country's most vital industrial centers. Leningrad, a vast metropolis and the cradle of the Soviet fleet, found itself under the threat of a blockade. At this time, the unfinished hull of the Petropavlovsk stood at the fitting-out quay of the Baltic shipyard. It looked like a giant beached whale, huge, imposing, but completely helpless. Without its main engines, without its full armor plating, and with only half its artillery ready, it couldn't leave the city on its own, and towing such a behemoth under the threat of air raids was suicidal. The Soviet command then made the only correct, pragmatic, and, in its own way, cruel decision. If the ship could not be a cruiser, it would become a fort, a floating artillery battery, an unyielding steel bastion in the shallows, built into the city's defense line. On August 15, 1941, the naval flag was raised over the gray, unfinished structure. Command was taken by Captain, second rank, Alexander Vanifatyev. Since going to sea wasn't even an option, the crew was reduced to the absolute minimum. Only those vital for firing the guns and maintaining the turret mechanisms remained: gunners, electricians, and diesel mechanics. Imagine the atmosphere on that ship. Enormous, echoing corridors designed for a crew of 1,000 were now empty. Dim emergency lighting flickered over unfinished bulkheads and coils of German cables. The sailors walked the decks, knowing this giant would never cut through the waves. It had become a stationary target. But this target had teeth. 4 powerful 8-inch guns in 2 turrets, and a full load of German shells, thoughtfully delivered by the ship's creators before the conflict began. In September, when the front line moved right up to the outskirts of Leningrad, the Petropavlovsk spoke for the first time. The roar of its main battery rolled over the city like a heavy, thunderous echo. 120-kilogram shells went screaming over the horizon. At that moment, history performed an incredible, paradoxical somersault. German guns, forged at Krupp factories, loaded with German powder and guided by sophisticated German optics, unleashed a storm of fire onto the advancing German divisions. The fire was corrected from the shore, and the heavy shells plowed the earth, crushing enemy equipment and fortifications with terrifying accuracy. The cruiser fought back like a cornered but incredibly dangerous predator. Its anti-aircraft guns, 37mm and 20mm rapid-fire cannons, continuously filled the sky with tracers, driving planes away from the port. But the enemy quickly realized where this threat was coming from. Heavy artillery from the other side of the front began to methodically, day by day, zero in on the stationary silhouette on the Neva, knowing every single one of its vulnerabilities better than anyone. With every passing day in September 1941, the ring around Leningrad tightened. The air over the city vibrated with the drone of heavy bombers and the wail of sirens. In this symphony of destruction, the cruiser Petropavlovsk stood out with the rhythmic thuds of its main battery. 8 inches of German steel were sending a return blow back to its creators. But it couldn't last forever. A massive, immobile ship at the trade port pier was a perfect target. This wasn't a duel of maneuverable cruisers in the open sea, where speed and course changes save lives. This was a positional siege of a steel fort, bolted to the ground. The sailors remaining on board lived under constant psychological pressure. Imagine their daily life. Cold metal bulkheads, the smell of burnt powder soaked into their clothes, and the constant echo of nearby shell bursts. And most oppressive of all, the realization that they were in a giant trap. The ship couldn't dodge. It couldn't retreat. Worse still, the enemy knew their target perfectly. The artillery officers correcting fire on Leningrad had the full blueprints of this very ship. They knew the armor thickness of every section. They knew where the magazine rooms were. They knew the upper deck had never received its armor plating before the war started. On September 17th, the worst began. Heavy enemy artillery unleashed a deluge of fire on the Petropavlovsk. 210mm guns methodically hammered heavy high-explosive shells into the defenseless deck of the unfinished cruiser. The sensory overload was colossal. The howl of falling shells merged with the screech of tearing metal. Geysers of water and mud erupted higher than the masts. The deck shuddered as if underground mines were exploding beneath it. Smoke from fires blotted out the sun, turning day into twilight. One shell pierced the thin deck and exploded inside the hull. Then another. And another. Internal compartments, unprotected by armored bulkheads, turned into fire traps. Power cables were severed, and the ship plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the flashes of fires. The sailors in the main battery turrets were cut off from the world. The electricity failed. Ventilation stopped. In the suffocating darkness, choking on smoke, the crews tried to manually rotate the multi-ton turrets and hoist heavy shells to fire back. Water rushed into the breaches. The powerful pumps meant to fight flooding wouldn't work without power. The massive hull began to list. The metal groaned, unable to withstand the water pressure. The cruiser slowly settled onto the bottom of the Neva. The crew fought desperately for survival, plugging holes in freezing water in total darkness. But it was impossible to save a stationary target from a methodical execution. The Petropavlovsk hit the mud. Its deck was almost entirely submerged, and its riddled superstructures stuck out of the waves like a picked-over skeleton. It seemed like the end. The ship was dead. Just another victim of a merciless siege. But the Soviet command and the freezing besieged city had completely different plans for this hunk of German steel. The winter of 1941 arrived, the harshest winter in the history of the besieged city. The temperature plummeted to critical levels, turning streets into snowy canyons. The Neva River was covered in a thick, impenetrable armor of ice, and in this icy prison, half submerged and frozen through, lay the Petropavlovsk. From the shore, it looked like a ghost, a dead piece of metal covered in white frost. The enemy had long ago crossed it off their lists, considering it completely destroyed. Officers on the other side of the front, having spent hundreds of heavy shells, looked through their binoculars with satisfaction at the mangled wreckage protruding from the ice. They were certain this giant would never speak again. But they underestimated one thing: the desperation of people with nothing to lose, and their staggering engineering ingenuity. Under the cover of the polar night, when the thermometer dropped below -30 degrees, dark silhouettes moved toward the frozen cruiser. They were Soviet engineers, divers, and surviving crew members. They walked across the crunching ice to a ship that had become a massive steel tomb. Their breath froze instantly on their collars. Fingers, devoid of feeling, gripped heavy tools. The task seemed physically impossible. Raise a multi-ton Titan from the bottom, patch the holes, and bring the complex German mechanisms back to life. All without warm clothing, on catastrophically low food rations, and under the constant threat of airstrikes. But the work began. Divers descended into the black, agonizingly cold water through holes in the ice to assess the damage. Imagine yourself in their place. Absolute darkness. Water that numbs the mind and cramps the muscles. And razor-sharp edges of torn metal that had to be studied by touch alone. And here a question arises that puzzles even modern mechanics. How do you repair unique foreign equipment when there isn't a single spare part and the blueprints are long since burned or lost? The Soviet specialists achieved the impossible. They disassembled damaged components, measured frozen gears with micrometers by the light of dim oil lamps, and machined replacements on surviving lathes in the besieged city. They crossbred German precision with rugged Soviet improvisation. Holes in the hull were sealed with multi-layered wooden patches and concreted right under the water. Powerful pumps worked for days to drain the flooded compartments. The ice around the ship was broken with heavy crowbars to free the gripped hull. The metal creaked and groaned in the night, like a living creature having its broken bones set without anesthesia. It was a titanic struggle against the elements. And it bore fruit. By the beginning of 1942, the Petropavlovsk slowly, inch by inch, lifted off the silty bottom. It floated, scarred and battered, but alive. Most importantly, its greatest assets, those turrets with 8-inch guns, could move again. Electricians managed to restore the severed power cables and restart the complex aiming mechanisms. The German guns, once trapped in ice, were ready to fire once more. The moment of truth came in January 1943, when the massive offensive to break the blockade began. The frozen, resurrected ghost ship spoke again with its thunderous voice. Blinding yellow flashes tore through the night gloom. Heavy shells flew toward the enemy's fortifications, crushing concrete bunkers and sweeping away any obstacles in the path of the advancing troops. This unfinished cruiser made a massive, tangible contribution to the city's liberation. It fulfilled its task. It survived the darkest of times. But when the global conflict finally ended and the smoke cleared, the naval leadership faced a completely new dilemma, and it involved astronomical sums of money. May 1945 brought a long-awaited silence. The roar of the guns died down. Europe lay in ruins, but for the first time in years, people could look at the sky without fear. The city on the Neva was shedding its icy shackles, counting its colossal losses, and preparing for a massive reconstruction. At this time, by the shell-pitted piers, riddled with shrapnel, with hastily welded patches and scorched paint, our hero stood silently, a veteran that had never once gone to the open sea. A massive steel invalid. On September 1st, 1944, in honor of the liberation of the Estonian capital, it received its third and final name, Tallinn. A resonant, proud name for a heavy cruiser. The Naval Command, buoyed by victory, enthusiastically took up plans to return it to a full life. It seemed logical to complete this masterpiece of engineering, include it in the victorious fleet, and send it to roam the oceans. But when the best minds of Soviet shipbuilding sat down for calculations, the enthusiasm began to fade rapidly. A heavy silence hung in the offices, broken only by the dry clicking of abacus beads and the rustle of drafting paper. Imagine the scale of the problem. The Tallinn wasn't just damaged, it was fundamentally, structurally, crippled by months of shelling and a winter spent on the river bottom. Its turbines, which were never fully installed, were rusted. The complex optics and fire control systems were ruined. The deck armor was non-existent. And crucially, it remained a German ship. A unique one-off piece for which not a single standard Soviet part would fit. Nuts, bolts, wire gauges, pipes, everything was different. To finish this Leviathan, one would have to recreate an entire production chain from scratch, according to German standards. Or completely gut the hull and refit it with Soviet equipment. Then the final document hit the desk. The estimate for the completion and modernization of the heavy cruiser Tallinn. The figure written in ink made the admirals gulp nervously. 191 million rubles. This wasn't just a big number, it was an economic knockout. The country, just emerging from the most destructive conflict in its history, lay in ruins. Millions of people were living in dugouts and destroyed houses. Factories were just switching to producing tractors and lathes. For 191 million rubles in those years, one could build more than one ship. It was the cost of an entire flotilla of brand new, modern destroyers. Or several light cruisers of the latest design that fit perfectly into the post-war naval doctrine. To spend such colossal resources on one single, albeit remarkable, but morally aging and crippled German hull was pure madness. On January 12, 1949, the inevitable happened. The pride of the Kriegsmarine, an Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruiser, was reclassified as a light cruiser with a stroke of a pen. This wasn't just a demotion, it was an admission that its heavy 8-inch turrets would never fire at a real target again. From that moment began a long, melancholy autumn in the life of the steel giant. It turned into a ghost, slowly fading on the outskirts of naval life. First, they tried to make it a training ship. In 1953, it was renamed the Non-Self-Propelled Training Vessel, Dnepr. Huge empty compartments, once designed to hold hundreds of tons of ammunition, were converted into barracks and classrooms for young cadets. Then it became a floating workshop for the new Soviet Sverdlov-class cruisers, the very ships built with the money saved by not repairing the Tallinn. What a bitter irony of fate. The former flagship, a potential ruler of the seas, now served as a utility shed, maintaining its luckier, younger brethren. And finally, the final act of humiliation. In April 1958, it was turned into PKZ-112, a floating barracks, a floating dormitory, a place where sailors slept, washed their uniforms, and wrote letters home, never thinking about what historical relic they were standing on. A month later, its history formally ended. The ship was struck from the naval lists. Powerful cranes and gas cutters went to work. The thick German armor, which had withstood hundreds of heavy shell hits, yielded to the onslaught of acetylene flames. The cruiser slowly, piece by piece, disappeared, turning into piles of scrap metal to be melted down into tractors, rails, or perhaps new ships. It seemed like an inglorious, sad finale. The end of a story about a grand failure, about tons of gold thrown to the wind in 1940. The story of a ship that never once raised anchor for a real battle. But if we look closely at the numbers, at the dry statistics of the global conflict, we come to a completely different, paradoxical conclusion. Let's put emotions aside. Let's forget for a moment about steel bulkheads, freezing sailors, and astronomical estimates. Let's look at the fate of the cruiser Tallinn, the former Lutzow, through the cold, merciless prism of macro history. When we evaluate the effectiveness of any weapon, we ask a simple question. How much damage did it do to the enemy? In the case of our unfinished giant, the answer seems disappointing. Yes, its main guns successfully hit enemy positions near Leningrad. Yes, It played an important role as a stationary fort during the darkest days of the siege. But if you put 104 million Reichsmarks in gold on one side of the scale and a few thousand shells on the other, the math clearly doesn't add up. Many historians still call this deal a failure of Soviet diplomacy, a mockery of common sense, a perfect example of how not to spend strategic reserves on the eve of a catastrophe. But what if we look at it from a completely different angle? What if the true victory of this ship lay not in what it did for the Soviet Navy, but in what it didn't do for the German one? Let's transport ourselves to the harsh waters of the North Atlantic. Imagine the scene. A cold, piercing wind whips the tops of the waves. A leaden sky merges with the horizon. Through this storm, an Allied convoy moves slowly and heavily. Dozens of lumbering transport ships, loaded to the brim with tanks, planes, ammunition, and food. A vital artery connecting America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Suddenly, a predatory silhouette appears on the horizon. This isn't a small, stealthy submarine. It is a steel leviathan capable of speeds over 30 knots. Its armor easily deflects the shells of the escorting destroyers, and its 8 heavy guns begin to methodically, with chilling German precision, pick off the defenseless transports one by one, staying well outside the range of their weak guns. This is exactly how the pocket battleships and heavy cruisers of the Kriegsmarine operated in the early years of the conflict. They were created for one purpose: to paralyze ocean communications. They sowed panic, forcing the Allies to divert massive forces to hunt them down. Take, for example, our hero's older brother, the lead ship of the series, Admiral Hipper. Remember its famous raid during Operation Wunderland. It alone terrorized convoys, sank several ships, and forced entire flotillas to change their routes. Every such raider was a strategic threat of global proportions. Now imagine if the German command had not one such ship in the north, but 2. If the deal hadn't happened in the spring of 1940. If the Lützow had remained in the shipyards of Bremen. German industry, working under stable conditions without the later logistical breakdowns, could have easily completed it by 1942. And then, at the most critical moment of the Battle of the Atlantic, when Donitz's U-boats were sinking millions of tons of shipping, another cutting-edge heavy cruiser would have hit the Allied supply lines. How many Lend-Lease transports would have gone to the bottom? How many thousands of tons of explosives, food, and medicine would never have reached Murmansk or Arkhangelsk? How many tanks would have failed to enter the battle at Stalingrad or Kursk, simply because they burned in the holds of sunken ships? The math of war is cruel, but fair. The purchase of the Lützow was a genius act of strategic denial. It was a deal that literally pulled the teeth out of a potential enemy before the fight even began. The Soviet Union paid 104 million marks in gold, a colossal sum. But in exchange, it deprived the Kriegsmarine of one of its most dangerous combat units. The Ghost Ship, the invalid ship that never went to sea under the Soviet flag, won its greatest battle simply by the fact of its absence from the enemy's line of battle. Let's look at one more aspect of this deal that is often forgotten. Imagine the Soviet shipbuilders of the late 1930s. The country had just started a massive program to build an ocean-going fleet. Experience in creating modern heavy artillery ships was critically low. They were learning on the fly, by trial and error, sometimes fatal errors. And suddenly, in the spring of 1940, right at the pier of the Baltic shipyard in Leningrad, not just a ship docks, a giant, 20,000-ton laboratory of advanced German technology docks. Yes, unfinished. Yes, without main turbines. But what was already installed inside that steel hull was of incredible value. The purchase of the Lützow was not just the acquisition of firepower. It was the purchase of a unique educational tool. Hundreds of Soviet engineers, designers, welders, and mechanics gained unfettered access to the secrets of one of the world's most advanced shipbuilding schools. They walked those decks, studied the layout of compartments, the armor system, the intricate web of pipes and cable runs. They disassembled complex units, trying to understand the logic of German designers. Of particular interest, of course, were the main battery turrets. The 8-inch guns, the famous Zeiss optics, the complex electromechanical shell feeding and aiming systems. Soviet specialists studied these mechanisms bolt by bolt, and this experience did not go to waste. Many technical solutions, borrowed from the Lutso, were later reflected in Soviet projects. The precision of calculations, the culture of production, the attention to the smallest details, all of this was absorbed, analyzed, and adapted for their own needs. And even when the ship turned into a stationary battery and then a semi-submerged target, it continued to serve, but as a testing ground. During the brutal shelling of Leningrad, Soviet engineers had a unique, albeit terrifying, opportunity to observe how German armor stood up to German shells. They analyzed the nature of the damage, studied how bulkheads deformed, and how fire spread through the compartments. It was a brutal crash test in real combat conditions. The data collected proved invaluable for the design of future Soviet ships. But the legacy of the Tallinn is not limited to blueprints and calculations. There is a material trail in its history that still sparks debate and urban legends. Remember we mentioned that in 1958 the ship was cut for scrap. 20,000 tons of high-alloy German steel. Where did it go? Official documents are dry and concise. Sent for remelting. But metallurgists know that steel of such quality is an immense rarity and value. Krupp armor plates, alloyed with nickel and chrome, possessed unique strength and toughness. To simply melt them down into rebar for Khrushchevka apartment blocks would have been unthinkable waste. There is evidence that a significant portion of this metal was carefully dismantled and sent to secret factories. There, the German armor was reforged, given a second life. It is said that elements of the Tallinn's armor can be found in the structures of some first-generation Soviet nuclear submarines, in the vault doors of strategic bunkers, in the components of experimental spacecraft. Of course, it is practically impossible to document these rumors now. But the very thought that steel forged in Bremen for the glory of the Third Reich ended up protecting Soviet nuclear secrets has an incredible magnetism. It is a perfect metaphor for the entire history of this ship. It was conceived as a weapon of aggression, but became a shield for a besieged city. It was meant to sink Allied convoys, but instead handed its secrets to Soviet designers. It never became a full cruiser, but its contribution to victory, both direct and indirect, is hard to overstate. When we look at old, faded photographs of this rusting giant at the Leningrad piers, we don't see a monument to a mistake. We see a monument to the paradoxes of history. A history where chance, political calculation, and harsh necessity are woven into an incredible knot. Today, nothing remains of the Tallinn. No hull, no turrets, not even a commemorative plaque on the Neva embankment. It was dissolved in smelting furnaces, erased from the fleet lists, and forgotten. For most people, it's just a line in a history book. Unfinished German cruiser. A mistake. Wasted money. But history does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, and in that lies its greatest irony. This ship was created to be the nightmare of the Atlantic, to sink the convoys bringing aid to the USSR, to be the pride of the Nazi fleet. Instead, it became the shield of Leningrad. Its guns fired at its own creators. Its armor protected the city it was supposed to blockade. Yes, it never went on long voyages. Yes, it rusted at the pier. But sometimes, to win a global conflict, you don't have to be a hero on a poster. Sometimes it's enough to simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time for the enemy, and in the right place for your own. The Tallinn fulfilled its task. It simply did not allow itself to be used against us. And perhaps it was the most profitable purchase in the history of the Soviet Navy.